The monitor beeped at exactly 3:14 in the morning. Not an alarm, not a code, just the quiet, steady rhythm of a heart that had already given up trying, and yet somehow kept going. Nurse Rachel Owens stood at the threshold of room 114 and watched the old man sleep. He was 71 years old. His name was Edmund Carroll, and in the 6 days he had been admitted to the ICU at St. Mercy General Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. Not a single person had come to visit him. Not one. She had checked the visitor log twice. Rachel was 34 years old. She had worked the night shift in the cardiac intensive care unit for 9 years, long enough to know that loneliness could be just as dangerous as any diagnosis. She had seen patients with mild conditions deteriorate simply because no one came. No hand to hold, no voice to recognize, just the cold hum of machines and the antiseptic smell of a room that felt more like a waiting room for death than a place of healing. She stepped inside quietly, checked his IV line, adjusted the oxygen sensor on his finger, and looked at the chart hanging at the foot of his bed. Stage 3 congestive heart failure, atrial fibrillation, a history of 2 previous heart attacks. His ejection fraction, the measure of how much blood his heart pumped with each beat, was at 22%. A healthy heart pumps at 55% or higher. Edmund Carroll's heart was barely whispering. The notes from his attending physician, Dr. Marcus Webb, were direct and clinical. Patient is not a surgical candidate at this time. Conservative management. Family notified. That last line, family notified, sat in Rachel's chest like a stone, because she had been there when Dr. Webb made that call. She had stood in the hallway and heard the brief conversation with Edmund's son, a man named Gerald Carroll, who lived 40 minutes away in Akron. Gerald had said he would try to come by the weekend. That had been 5 days ago. Rachel pulled the small visitor's chair close to Edmund's bedside and sat down. She wasn't supposed to linger. There were 4 other patients on the floor that night, and her rounds were never truly finished. But something about this man, about the way his hands rested open on the blanket, like he was waiting for someone to take them, made her stay just a moment longer. His eyes opened. They were pale blue and still sharp. The eyes of a man whose mind had not followed, his body into decline. "You're still here," he said. His voice was hoarse, roughened by the nasal cannula that had been delivering oxygen to his lungs for nearly a week. "Just checking on you, Mr. Carroll." "Edmund," he corrected her gently. "Mr. Carroll was my father, and he was a far less pleasant man than I am." Despite everything, Rachel smiled. "How are you feeling, Edmund?" He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved to the ceiling. That particular gaze she had come to recognize in patients who were measuring their remaining days not in years, but in something smaller. "Hours, maybe, sunrises." "Tired," he said finally. "Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes." Rachel understood. She had heard those words before in different forms from different mouths. They always meant the same thing. "Is there anyone I can call for you?" she asked. "Anyone you'd like to talk to tonight?" He turned his head toward her then, and the expression on his face broke something open in her chest. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was something older than sadness, something that had been carried so long it had stopped feeling like a wound and had just become the shape of things. "My wife passed 4 years ago," he said. "Eleanor. She used to read to me when I couldn't sleep. Mystery novels mostly. She had a terrible habit of guessing the ending out loud and then apologizing when she was right." He almost laughed, but it turned into a cough, and Rachel leaned forward instinctively, her hand resting on his forearm until it passed. "My son, Gerald, he's got his own life, his own troubles. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden, Edmund." "That's kind of you to say." He looked at her hand on his arm. He didn't move away from it. "You know what I miss most? I miss someone just sitting with me, not fixing anything, not explaining anything, just sitting." Rachel looked at this man. This 71-year-old man with a failing heart and an empty visitor, log and hands that rested open like a question no one was answering. And she made a decision that had nothing to do with her job description. She reached across to the small shelf beside his bed, picked up the worn paperback that was sitting there, a mystery novel She noticed the cover cracked and soft from years of reading, and she opened it to the first page. "Would you like me to read to you?" she asked. Edmund Carroll looked at her for a long moment. His pale blue eyes grew bright in a way that had nothing to do with the overhead light. "I would like that very much," he whispered. And so at 3:21 in the morning, in the cardiac ICU of St. Mercy General Hospital, with monitors beeping and the night stretched long and dark around them, Rachel Owens began to read. She read in a low, steady voice, pausing when he closed his eyes, continuing when she saw the small movement of his lips. That meant he was following along. She stayed for 40 minutes. She should not have stayed that long. She stayed anyway. When she finally rose to leave, Edmund caught her hand. "Why?" he asked. Just that, one word. Rachel thought about it honestly. "Because Eleanor sounds like she was wonderful," she said. "And because you deserve someone in your corner tonight." She did not know in that moment that what she had just done would travel far beyond that room. 3 doors down, in room 117, a 28-year-old woman named Diana. Reyes had been awake the entire time. The walls in the ICU were not thick. Diana had been admitted 6 days earlier as well, not for her heart, but for her kidneys. She had been diagnosed 8 months ago with focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, a progressive kidney disease that had destroyed her kidney function to the point where dialysis was no longer enough. She needed a transplant. She had been on the national waiting list for 7 months. Her nephrologist, Dr. Priya Nair, had told her 2 days ago that her condition was accelerating faster than anticipated. Without a kidney in the next few weeks, the conversation would change in ways no one in that room wanted to have. Diana was a 3rd-grade teacher from a small school in the east side of Cleveland. She was not married. She had a mother, Rosa, who worked 2 jobs and had already drained her savings, helping cover the medical bills that insurance had not touched. The number on Diana's outstanding hospital bill was $94,000 and climbing. Rosa had stopped mentioning it because every time she did, Diana's blood pressure spiked, and the nurses had to come in and adjust her medication. Diana had a brother, Marco, who was 26 and healthy. He had been tested 8 weeks ago as a potential living donor. He was a match, a near-perfect match, which Dr. Nair had described as genuinely rare good fortune. Marco had said no. He had said it quietly, apologetically, with tears in his eyes, but he had said it. He had a fear of surgery so severe it had a clinical name, tomophobia, and he had explained, through a counselor, that he could not go through with the procedure. Diana had told him she understood. She had meant it. She was not angry at her brother, but she was terrified, and she was alone in that terror in the way that only sick people understand, surrounded by care and still profoundly, architecturally alone. She had heard Rachel's voice through the wall, reading, low and steady and kind. And Diana had pressed her fingers against the wall and listened, and something in her had cracked open and then, quietly, settled. The next morning, Rachel came back on shift after 6 hours of sleep. She never slept well after nights like that, and found a note tucked under the door of the nurses' station. It was handwritten on a piece of hospital notepad paper. It said, "I heard you last night. I don't know if you know how much that mattered. Not just to him, to me too. I'm Diana in 117. I just wanted someone to know that what you did was not small. D." Rachel stood in the hallway holding that note for a long time. She went to room 117 that afternoon. What happened over the next 4 days was not a miracle. There were no miracles here. What happened was slower and more human than that. Rachel, who had spent 9 years building quiet relationships with the social workers and patient advocates and donor coordinators at St. Mercy, made a series of phone calls. She connected Diana's case with a donor advocacy organization that specialized in paired exchange programs, a system where living donors who don't match their intended recipient can donate to a stranger in exchange for their loved one receiving a kidney from a different compatible donor. It was a chain, a human chain of strangers, linked by biology and willingness and a kind of courage. That doesn't make headlines, but saves lives every single day. She also called Gerald Carroll. She did not ask him to come. She simply told him, honestly, that his father had talked about Eleanor and mystery novels and not wanting to be a burden. She said Edmund was not doing well. She said she thought Gerald might want to know that before the choice of coming was no longer his to make. Gerald arrived that same evening. He walked into room 114 with red eyes and a paper coffee cup he'd been gripping so hard the sides had buckled, and when Edmund looked up and saw him, neither of them said anything for a long time. Gerald sat in the same chair Rachel had sat in at 3 in the morning. He picked up the mystery novel from the shelf. He opened it to the page with the folded corner. He began to read. 3 weeks later, Diana Reyes received a kidney from a 41-year-old man named Thomas Hale, who had initially volunteered to donate to his college roommate, whose recipient had then freed up a match for someone else in the chain, which had wound its way through 4 hospitals and 5 strangers until it reached Diana. Dr. Nair stood in the doorway of Diana's recovery room the morning after surgery and told her that her new kidney was already functioning. Diana cried. Rosa cried. The recovery room nurse pretended not to cry and then cried anyway. Edmund Carroll was discharged 2 weeks after Gerald's arrival. He was not cured. Congestive heart failure does not reverse itself, but he was stable enough to go home, to the house in Cleveland where Eleanor's mystery novels still lined the shelves in alphabetical order by author. Gerald drove him. They stopped on the way for coffee, and Gerald stayed for dinner and then stayed the night, and in the morning made eggs the way his mother used to, and Edmund sat at the kitchen table and ate every bite. On Edmund's last day in the hospital, he had stopped Rachel in the hallway, slowly, carefully, with Gerald steadying his arm. "You read 12 pages, he said. Rachel blinked. "What?" "That night. You read 12 pages before you had to go." He reached into the pocket of his discharge day cardigan and held out the paperback. "I want you to have it. Find out how it ends." Rachel took the book. She looked at the cover. She turned it over. She read the back. She looked up at Edmund Carroll with his pale blue eyes and his open hands. "How does it end?" she asked. He smiled. "Better than you'd expect," he said. "They always do." What Rachel Owens did at 3 in the morning was not in any manual. It was not a protocol. It was not billable. It was not measurable by any metric that hospital administrators track on quarterly reports. She simply sat with a man who needed someone to sit with him. She simply read aloud in a quiet voice in a dark room. And that act, small and human and unremarkable on its surface, moved through the walls of that hospital like something with a pulse of its own, touching Diana, reaching Gerald, joining itself to a chain of strangers who would never all meet in one room but who were, in the most essential way, connected. This is the truth about kindness that we forget when we are tired or overwhelmed or convinced that we have nothing meaningful to give. Kindness does not require resources. It does not require perfect timing or grand gestures or the right words. Sometimes it requires only the willingness to stay a little longer than you were supposed to read 12 pages, to make one phone call, to press your hand against a wall and let someone on the other side know they are not as alone as the silence suggests. The heart monitor in room 114 beeped quietly through the night. And in that sound, steady, persistent, refusing to quit, there was something that sounded, if you listened closely enough, like hope. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love or a moment, when a small act of kindness changed your direction, please take a second and subscribe to Soul of Kindness. Every story on this channel exists to remind you of what human beings are capable of when they choose to show up for one another. You being here matters more than you know. And before you go, we want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a small act of kindness that turned out to be far bigger than it seemed in the moment? Tell us in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone scrolling past needs to read today.